It's a quiet suburban evening in Hinsdale, Illinois. A red brick building sits on a lush 223-acre campus, unmarked and unremarkable at first glance. Neighbors occasionally see groups of teenage girls strolling in a nearby park, dressed identically in ankle length skirts with red scarves around their necks, and boys in dark suits with very neat ties. It all looks very wholesome, like a snapshot from a more innocent time. But behind the cheery smiles and matching outfits lies an insidious secret. This isn't just a church youth group or a private school. It's the headquarters of the Institute in Basic Life Principles, or IBLP, an organization that many would later call a cult. For decades, IBLP flew under the radar, promising families a path to godly success and harmony. But not anymore. And today, we are unpacking all of it. So sit back, relax, and take a deep breath. It's time to let the fresh air in. Hello, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Erin, and I am fascinated by all things cult, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. I post a couple videos on one of these topics every single week, so if you're into that sort of thing, please consider subscribing. I would absolutely love to have you here. Now, today we are going to get right into this video. This group is basically tied to the Duggar family scandal. So if after this video you're like, I want to learn even more and I want to do a deep dive on the whole Duggar scandal and their family, with this context now added to that, please let me know. I've kind of already been working on it just as like my own personal interest side project, but I just always want to make you guys happy because I'm a people pleaser. So let me know if that's something you're interested in. I feel like lately I've been trying to cover cults that I haven't covered yet, even though a lot of other people have covered yet, because I'm like, I want the repertoire to be there. So if someone is binging the channel and just gets obsessed and wants to like learn about everything, they have the resource here. But also sometimes those videos don't do very well because it's like, oh, not the Manson family again. So I'm kind of in this place of like, should I just do the obscure ones? Should I do the well-known ones? Should I just cover them all since there's thousands? So y'all just let me know down below. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and jump right in to the Institute of Basic Life Principles. Sounds like something everybody might need to know, right? Well, I think they do this very, very methodically and specifically to try to rope people in because these are the basic life principles, right? Wrong. But millions of people have attended seminars and bought into this strict code of quote unquote Christian living. And its founder, Bill Gothard, became a revered patriarchal figure who preached absolute obedience and moral purity. Parents believed they'd found the formula for raising perfect, shiny, happy families. But in 2014, that shiny facade began to crack. Whispered allegations turned into a public scandal, revealing a darker story of control, abuse, and hypocrisy at the heart of IBLP. So, who was this guy, Bill Gothard? Because you really can't understand how IBLP became so powerful until you understand who this guy is. Well, William or Bill Gothard Jr. was born in 1934 right in Hinsdale, Illinois, where his cult would end up flourishing. Now, faith ran very deep in his family. His father was an executive with Gideon's International, the ministry who was famous for placing Bibles in hotel rooms. Now, as a teenager in the 1950s, young Bill was intensely devout, and by age 15, he had publicly dedicated his life to God and was absolutely determined to help other youths make wise choices and avoid the moral pitfalls that he saw among his peers. Yeah, sounds like someone's being a little judgy as a teen. Maybe he wasn't so angsty, but he was definitely judgy. So, in the late 1950s, Gothard attended Wheaton College, which was an evangelical stronghold, where he ended up earning a degree in biblical studies because, of course. He went on to get a master's in Christian education. So it's like he was already kind of indoctrinated himself. He didn't really see any mainstream education or non Christian biased education. So it was during his graduate studies in 1961 that he penned a very curious master's thesis, one that would end up changing the course of his life and also countless American families. In it, he outlined 7 biblical, non optional principles of life. Now, this is for a thesis statement. And I don't know about you, but I've written a thesis statement. Well, I've written a thesis. And if you have also, yes, you pour a lot of energy and resources and research into it. But I feel like my point of view when I was, in college in my late teens, early 20s, because I graduated college at 20, I would not listen to myself from back then. You know what I mean? Like, good for you. You wrote a thesis. That doesn't mean that it's the principles that everyone in the world needs to follow. But he promised that if you lived by these principles, that you would have harmonious relationships in all areas of life. Now, these 7 principles later became the basic life principles, and they would become the bedrock of his ministry. Quote, 7 principles to fix every problem in life. It sounds bold. Did he really believe it was that simple? Well, it appears yes. Gothard basically packaged a formula. The principles had names like design, authority, responsibility, suffering, ownership, freedom, and success. He taught that these were universal laws ordained by God. If you followed them to the letter, you would reap blessings. But if you broke those rules, even unwittingly, if you didn't even mean to, you would invite calamity into your life. It was a very black and white worldview that offered certainty amid chaos in the kind of uncertainty of the 1960s. I mean, this is a time when the country is really in turmoil. There are so many civil rights movements going on. There's war being threatened. We're still just outside of world wars. So it's a very tumultuous time with a lot of different types of ideologies starting to come to the surface. And it's also a time when people are starting to turn away from Christianity. So these more definitive, like, here are the exact rules to live by in order to achieve a beautiful, successful life, it really resonated with a lot of people. People were hungry for that. Like, all of a sudden, there are so many different paths to take. The country was kind of starting at least to steer away from that idea of a nuclear family. And there were possibilities of so many different ways of life starting to open up. So these Christian groups who were probably very desperate for people to come to their church and give them offerings were trying to have a definitive offer to the people they were serving within their community. Do this and you'll reap rewards. Don't do this and it will be sinful. So I think that's part of why this kind of resonated with so many Christians or Christians who were kind of starting to question Christianity itself. So, in 1961, armed with his thesis and a missionary zeal, 26-year-old Gothard, yep, who's only 26 years old, decided to launch a small organization called Campus Teams out of his home in LaGrange, Illinois. His initial mission? Troubled teens in Chicago's inner city and, quote, families in crisis. The goal was to share biblical teachings to help parents and youth resolve conflict and live righteously. And even in those early days, Gothard cast himself as a counselor who could bridge the generational gap with scripture. And the timing, like I mentioned before, was key. I mean, America was on the cusp of social upheaval, and many Christian conservatives feared the rising tides of that rock and roll drug culture and the sexual revolution. How dare they? But Gothard's message was a beacon. Return to these basic biblical principles, and your family could weather any storm. Now, by the late 1960s, Gothard's work evolved into a traveling seminar called Basic Youth Conflicts. In 1968, he held his first major seminar at his alma mater, Wheaton College, and word spread like wildfire in church circles. Here was a clean cut, soft spoken preacher offering answers, 7 simple answers to the most complex problems of rebellious kids and strained families. The appeal was absolutely tremendous, and within just a few years, Gothard was packing arenas with eager crowds. Attendance at his seminars swelled to as many as 10 to 20,000 people per event by the early 1970s. I mean, that just feels so massive for the time, honestly. And in city after city across the US and even up into Canada, thousands of people sat for hours, pens in hand, as Gothard often used an overhead projector and reams of notes to teach his formula for successful living. And I mean, you can really imagine the scene, right? Fathers in their polyester suits and mothers in their modest dresses, teenagers and pastors, and even lawmakers in the audience. And from the stage, Gothard delivered his points with a calm authority. He didn't have any of that fire and brimstone theatrics of a stereotypical tent revivalist. Instead, his style was methodical and earnest, more like a teacher delivering a lecture. He would thunder at times about the dangers of stepping out from under authority or the perils of debt and rock music, but it was always under the banner of the Bible's truth. And people, well, they just drank it in. By 1974, the ministry formally renamed itself the Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts, or IBYC, to match the seminar's branding. Gothard's influence in evangelical circles was now undeniable. His basic youth conflict seminars were the must see events for Christian parents anxious about the Cultural Revolution. As one religious writer later noted, Gothard was, quote, packing arenas with thousands of Christian conservatives eager to hear how his 7 basic principles could shield their families from the cultural upheaval of the late 60s and early 70s, unquote. A shield. That's what Gothard was selling. And many families were more than ready to buy it. So by the 1980s, Bill Gothard's operation had grown far beyond a traveling seminar. To reflect its expanded scope, IBYC changed its name one final time in 1989 to the now familiar Institute in Basic Life Principles. The word youth was dropped as Gothard's teaching spread to every age group and facet of life. And indeed, life principles is an apt term. IBLP promised guidance on all aspects of daily living, from how to run your family, to manage your finances, even how to dress and court and dance, or rather, not dance. So, what exactly did IBLP teach? Well, at the core was a rigid hierarchy of authority. Of course. Think of an umbrella, which is a metaphor that Gothard often used. God, or Jesus, is the big umbrella on top. And under God's authority comes the husband slash father who is accountable to God, not their wife, God. Now, beneath him is the wife who's under her husband's authority, and under them, the children obeying both their parents. Yeah, sounds great. So revolutionary. Yeah, let's all obey the man who is only accountable to a being in the sky that none of us know for sure exists. Sounds Sounds like a recipe for accountability, if you ask me. Pastors and secular authorities like employers and government also fit in the chain above the husband in their respective spheres. The message was hammered home relentlessly. If you stay under your God given authority, you will be protected and blessed. But if you step out, even for a moment, you open yourself to calamity and Satan's attacks. In Gothard's word, authority must be respected at all costs. LOL. Do you guys know how I feel about all this? It just feels like so full circle because of all of the alpha men and they want their trad wives. And it just feels so on the nose for me right now. But it's also so laughable just because, if you've seen any trad wife who has like a million views on TikTok, she's actually making her family money. So she's effectively not a trad wife. Tangent, but that's just kind of what this is making me think of in the moment. So I thought I would mention it. So obviously, and I think I would consider myself like one of these critics, but critics have described this as a system of, quote, male superiority and female obedience. Wives were taught to be completely submissive to their husband's leadership to the point of joyfully accepting all decisions. I'm so sorry. I'm obviously a feminist. No one's telling me what to do, okay? Now, husbands, in turn, were told to exercise servant leadership, a benevolent sounding term that nonetheless put them firmly in command of the household. Any cracks in this order were dangerous. Now, if a wife ever challenged her husband or a child ever rebelled against a father, they were said to be stepping out from under the umbrella of God's protection, exposing themselves to grave spiritual and even physical harm. Yikes. In other words, Father knows best because God said so. Okay. And what if you think, I don't think so, not for me? Well, you better prepare for demonic torment or worse. Now, to an outsider, this all might sound very extreme, but within the bubble of IBLP, this was presented as absolute truth that was backed by scripture. Many followers literally feared that a moment's disobedience could invite a lightning bolt of divine punishment. So, under these teachings, IBLP families developed an elaborate list of do's and don'ts to remain in God's favor. And it went far beyond typical church rules. Dating? Strictly forbidden. Only parent supervised courtship was allowed with zero physical contact before marriage. You might be able to sneak in a side hug at most. Modern music, dancing, television, all banned. Gothard taught that rock and pop music, even Christian contemporary music with a strong beat, could stimulate lust or even rebellion. Dancing could arouse sensual desires. Television and movies were full of worldly temptations. Even benign children's fare like VeggieTales, which is a Bible themed cartoon, was considered to be too irreverent and was banned in some IBLP homes. One former member recounted that Cabbage Patch Kids dolls were outlawed because Gothard claimed they had occult origins and caused, quote, strange destructive behavior in children. And the list goes on. No secular books, only the Bible and approved religious texts were allowed. No college for girls because they should be training for marriage, not careers. And no birth control because children are blessings and you should have as many as God gives. You're never allowed to have any debt, ever. No alcohol, no smoking, and there were also some very strict rules on attire. So obviously, we're seeing a lot of information and behavior control here, right? But clothing, it was like a big, big, big one. IBLP published exacting guidelines, especially for women, to ensure modesty. This, of course, meant long skirts or dresses only. Pants on women were generally deemed immodest or masculine. Skirts had to cover the knees, and tops had to cover the shoulders to avoid any hint of cleavage. I am breaking so many rules right now. Even a long necklace could be seen as drawing too much attention to the very sexy neckline. Now, Gothard liked to say that women's bodies are defrauding to men if not properly covered, essentially blaming women for male lust. How convenient for all the men who are at the top of this bullshit umbrella. Now, young ladies in IBLP learned to be ever vigilant about not causing their brothers in Christ to stumble into their vaginas, I guess. All of these rules were ostensibly about holiness, but former followers say it was really about fear and control. Quote, Gothard's teaching in a nutshell are based on fear and superstition, unquote. Now, this is what Ginger Duggar said, who was raised in the IBLP community and would eventually leave. Because, quote, the fear kept me crippled with anxiety. I was terrified of the outside world, unquote. Now, Ginger was one of the 19 children in that well-known IBLP family, the Duggars. And she remembers believing that even a trip to the grocery store could invite divine wrath if it wasn't explicitly God's will. She says, quote, I thought I could be killed in a car accident on the way because I didn't know if God wanted me to stay home and read my Bible instead, unquote. I mean, she was constantly in a state of dread that her and many children like her would end up internalizing. Under Gothard's system, normal childhood innocence was replaced with this paranoia. Every action you made had spiritual stakes. And yet, families kept flocking to IBLP's message. Why? Because on the surface, many IBLP followers did appear to have polite, well-mannered kids and harmonious homes. In the era of cultural tumult, Gothard offered a throwback vision of the perfect Christian family, patriarchal, clean-cut, and obedient. For parents watching the sexual revolution outside, alongside the feminine movement with alarm, this would be a relief to them. They could raise, quote, Jesus-loving, parent-honoring, drug-free, and modest, unquote, kids while the rest of society was just going off the rails. IBLP essentially marketed nostalgia and control as a package deal. Accept the constraints, and you won't have to worry about teenage rebellion, unwanted pregnancies, or unruly wives. It sounded like a fair trade to those who were desperate to safeguard their family's souls. And ironically, the chief architect of these family ideals, Bill Gothard, never got married and never had children of his own. He remained a lifelong bachelor, claiming he was devoting himself wholly to the Lord's work. In Gothard's view, marriage was vital for women, but certain men, perhaps conveniently men like himself, could be called by God to singleness to better serve the ministry. And obviously, this double standard has not been lost on critics. How, they ask, could a man with zero experience as a husband or a father presume to dictate how every family should operate? But within IBLP, nobody questioned Brother Gothard. He was regarded as a wise, anointed teacher with a special revelation from God. And if anything, followers saw his unmarried status as a sign of extraordinary dedication. He was willing to sacrifice a family of his own to lead the larger IBLP family. Aww. Now, through the 1970s and 80s, IBLP exploded in size and scope. But Gothard was not content with a yearly seminar circuit. He wanted to embed his principles in everyday life and institutions. In 1984, he launched the Advanced Training Institute, or ATI, a homeschooling program that allowed families to educate their children with curricula centered entirely on Gothard's interpretation of the Bible. So instead of standard textbooks, ATI students used 54, quote, wisdom booklets that were created by IBLP, which blended academics with biblical lessons on character. Math, science, and English was all taught, but with a very heavy religious overlay. So, for example, an ATI science lesson might start with a story of Jesus calming the storm before segueing into meteorology. And by the 90s, thousands of families had enrolled at ATI, effectively putting their kids' education in Gothard's hands. Yeah, so no real education, just Bible weather studies. And honestly, it didn't even stop at homeschooling. IBLP branched out into a vast array of ministries, over 60 different programs by one count. And they ran a chain of youth training centers that operated community outreach for troubled youth. They managed orphanages overseas and even dabbled in programs for prisoners. And in fact, IBLP developed a curriculum known as Character First, which found its way into some public schools, in prisons, and even police training in various states, which feels ironic to me. Now, under secular branding, they taught Gothard's character principles like obedience, punctuality, etc., without overt scripture as a way to try to influence public institutions. Now, according to the producers of Shiny Happy People, IBLP's ideology went into our police system and it even went into the military. The reach was global too. IBLP sent materials and set up outposts from Australia all the way to Central America. By their own boasting, they served individuals and groups in at least a dozen countries. Now, one striking measure of IBLP's reach was the organization claimed that over 2.5 million people have attended its seminars over the decades. And obviously, that is not an insignificant number. It rivals the attendance of some major evangelical crusades. Throughout the 80s, Gothard was regularly filling large auditoriums. He even held special seminars for pastors, physicians, and legislatures to extend his influence among professionals. So, by appealing to lawmakers and community leaders, Gothard aimed to infuse his principles into public policy and civic life. In the 1990s, his seminars became popular among certain conservative lawmakers, and IBLP cultivated friends in some very high places. And indeed, political support began to bolster IBLP's credibility. Over the years, a number of prominent conservative politicians and personalities were linked to Gothard's orbit. For example, former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, a well known evangelical figure, appeared at IBLP events and once praised Gothard's character programs. Sarah Palin, the Alaska governor turned vice presidential candidate, and Rick Perry, the Texas governor, have also been listed among IBLP's high profile supporters. While not were all deeply involved, their endorsements or appearances lent Gothard an aura of mainstream acceptance. To his followers, if leaders like Huckabee or Palin gave a nod, it reinforced that IBLP's teachings were not fringe at all, but rather the key to saving America's morality. Now, by the late 1990s, IBLP was flush with cash and clout. In 2006, it was reported that the ministry's revenue exceeded $60 million a year. I wonder how many starving children they saved. Be really interested to get the statistics on that. I mean, these people amassed properties, training centers, and campuses in Illinois, Michigan, Oklahoma, Texas, everywhere. One campus was a sprawling 3,000-acre Northwoods retreat in Michigan, originally used as a place to send youth. The crown jewel, however, remained the Hinsdale, Illinois headquarters, a stately campus where staff and apprentices lived and worked under Gothard's close supervision, aka where his inner circle lived. Now, despite its growth, IBLP kept a somewhat low profile outside evangelical circles. I mean, ask your average neighbor in 2000 if they'd ever heard of it, and they probably haven't. Now, to the extent IBLP was known, it was often described benignly as a Christian ministry for family values. Locals near the headquarters only knew that something unusual was going on. All those conservatively dressed youths and the mysterious going on behind brick walls, I mean, it was anyone's guess. Inside this little bubble, red flags were starting to emerge. Even as Gothard's influence spread, whispers of discontent and even worse began to circulate among those who had spent time in the inner circle. Some started calling IBLP a cult in hushed jokes, never daring to say it too loudly. But as we know, many a truth is said in jest. In IBLP's case, the evidence of cult like dynamics was mounting. The extreme control over members' lives, the veneration of the leader, the isolation from the outside influence, and the suppression of any dissent. The first major crack in IBLP's pristine image actually came in the early 1980s, and it involved Bill Gothard's own family. Now, while Gothard preached strict sexual morality to the masses, behind closed doors, his young brother Steve Gothard was creating a scandal that could have toppled the ministry. Steve was an administrative director at IBLP and oversaw the Northwoods Retreat Center in Michigan. In 1980, revelations emerged that Steve Gothard had been engaging in sexual misconduct with several female staffers at the campus. Now, these young women, volunteers in their late teens or early 20s, had been sent to Northwoods at Bill's direction, ostensibly to try to help with administrative work. And instead, some ended up being coerced into secret sexual relationships with Steve. One particularly harrowing account came from a woman named Ruth, who had been Bill Gothard's personal secretary before being transferred to work under Steve. According to reports, Steve psychologically abused her for months and then pressured her into sex, exploiting her trust and naivete. Now, this was not just an isolated incident, multiple staffers were involved. When the scandal came to light, the fallout was dramatic. Steve Gothard was forced to resign in disgrace around 1980, and Bill Gothard, who had always preached absolute purity, suddenly had to explain how his own brother under his roof had been carrying on affairs with underage girls. Yeah. And Bill's response was pretty telling. He claimed ignorance. I didn't know what was happening. It's not my fault that my brother did that. But many people in the ministry were not convinced. It appeared that Bill had either turned a blind eye or actually might have enabled Steve by supplying him with a stream of vulnerable young women. For years, Bill had publicly held his ministry to the highest of moral standards, so this hypocrisy hit really hard. Under pressure from his board and other Christian leaders, Bill Gothard had to step down as president of IBLP briefly in the wake of this scandal, and it seemed like the Gothard empire might collapse then and there. But remarkably, Bill managed a comeback. After a 3-week hiatus, he was reinstated to leadership. Now, sources say that many rank and file followers never actually ever heard about the Steve Gothard incident, and it was just swept right under the rug, framed as a family matter that was resolved by Steve's resignation. Now, Bill resumed his seminars, and the machine just rolled on as if nothing happened. Yeah, so he still got to stay in the company that he exploited and used to prey upon young women. And as I'm sure you could guess, this early scandal foreshadowed a pattern. Allegations of impropriety would emerge, and IBLP would just handle them quietly in house, and Bill Gothard would carry on virtually unscathed. This set the stage for how the ministry would deal with future accusations. Prioritize the ministry's survival and reputation above transparency or even justice. Within the cloistered world of IBLP's headquarters, meanwhile, Gothard's control over staff was only tightening. By the 1990s, the Hinsdale headquarters had 2 to 300 staffers and apprentices living on site or in nearby IBLP owned housing. And these were often idealistic homeschool graduates, many from ATI, who were thrilled to be selected to serve God's work under Gothard. They signed on as, you guessed it, unpaid or very modestly paid interns, expecting spiritual growth and ministry experience in return. But what they found was a highly controlled environment that regulated nearly every aspect of their lives. Staff lived in gender segregated housing with strict curfews and no outside dating. They worked long hours for the ministry in roles from clerical work to landscaping with minimal contact with the outside world. Internet, TV, secular music, it was all banned. Even communication with their own families was sometimes monitored. Gothard was not just their boss. On campus, he was effectively lord of their lives. He was the boss, the landlord, and the controller of all aspects of their lives. This is how a later lawsuit would describe his role. Former staff recall how Gothard imposed odd rules like no eye gazing between members of the opposite sex, and requiring smiles at all times to display a bright countenance. Minor infractions could result in public shaming or expulsion from the program. Now, this was a classic high control group tactic. Enforce arbitrary rules to break individuality and ensure obedience. And then there was Gothard's special attention to certain young women on staff. Over the years, insiders whispered about Gothard's girls, or even his harem, a group of very pretty and very young female assistants that he kept in close company. He often personally chose teenage girls from seminar audiences or ATI conferences and invited them to work at HQ. These girls were typically 16 to 18 years old and would suddenly find themselves transplanted to Hinsdale, given roles as secretaries or assistants directly under Gothard. He obviously, I'm sure you could guess, favored those who were attractive, obedient, and from devout families who trusted him. Now, once there, they were subject to Gothard's every whim. And I think we all know where this is going. One former staffer from the 90s, whom we will call Julie, later recounted her disturbing experience in detail. At 16, Julie met Gothard at a Texas seminar. He praised her, quote, bright, shining countenance, unquote, and 2 years later invited her to work at HQ, a prestigious offer for a homeschooled teen. But upon arrival, Julie couldn't help but feel that something was off. She was given a job sitting alone in a lobby, isolated from all the other followers. Each time she started making friends with her roommate, Gothard would reassign her to a different room just to try to keep her totally off balance. And she wasn't able to connect with any other women. And other staff began to label her as rebellious for no apparent reason, which is one of the worst stigmas in the IBLP culture of unquestioning obedience. Julie would be reprimanded by supervisors almost daily, despite her best efforts to follow every single rule. And she now believes that Gothard orchestrated all of this to try to socially isolate her even further so that he could become her sole source of comfort. And indeed, Gothard positioned himself as her protector, the one kind face amidst her daily humiliation. And before long, Gothard started breaking his own rules with Julie. He would invite her to stay in his office after hours, sometimes well past the 9 p.m. curfew that everyone else strictly observed. Now, remember, in Gothard's IBLP, an unmarried man and a woman weren't even supposed to be alone in a room together. Yet here was Uncle Bill, nearly 65 years old, keeping an 18-year-old subordinate with him late into the night. So, as you might imagine, this story does not end innocently. Julie recalls one night when she was dutifully transcribing Gothard's dictated notes that she suddenly realized he had fallen silent. She looked up to find him staring at her with his genitals exposed. She was obviously horrified and confused. I mean, this sheltered young woman literally did not understand what proposition was being made. She just knew that it felt very wrong. So, flustered, she tried to excuse herself and then she left for the night. Now, Gothard didn't physically stop her, and nothing more was said. And in fact, it took Julie years to fully process that this was actually a sexual advance. Only after leaving IBLP and learning of other stories did she start to recognize the pattern. Bill Gothard had been grooming her, just as he had allegedly done with several others. Julie's experience, as sickening as it was far from unique. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, rumors swirled of Gothard's inappropriate behavior with female staff, from touching, fondling, intimate whispering, counseling sessions that crossed boundaries. Some even described Gothard's habit of playing footsie with teenage girls under the table, or giving lingering front hugs, or stroking the girl's hair and holding their hands. And this was all done under the guise of fatherly affection or spiritual encouragement. I mean, remember, this man had zero tolerance for any sexual impropriety among his followers, yet he himself was inching right up to that line time and time again. And for a long time, these young women felt totally alone and ashamed, often blaming themselves because remember, women are indoctrinated to believe that they are the ones that tempt the men. They are shamed if a man steps out of these very conservative rules. So they were blamed and shamed. These young, impressionable, naive women. IBLP's own teachings trapped them in silence. They'd been taught to not even know the word for what was happening to them. And obviously, you were probably guessing that they didn't teach normal sex education there. A lot of kids grew up not even knowing the basics of sex, let alone SA or even consent. So imagine being a 17-year-old told your entire life that any sexual feeling is sin, and suddenly your spiritual leader is behaving in a much too friendly manner. It would probably be almost impossible to articulate what you're feeling or what you experienced or report it. Plus, if there was any challenge to Gothard's authority, it was totally unthinkable. But also, who would believe them over the famous Bill Gothard? And tragically, for decades, none of them felt safe enough to speak out publicly. Yet, within the organization's upper echelons, some knew or suspected the truth. There are accounts of at least one staffer confronting Gothard about his conduct as early as the mid 2000s, and those concerns were just dismissed. In 2007, Gothard reportedly dismissed a longtime board member who started asking questions about the Gothard girls' rumors. Gothard decided then he was going to consolidate power, and he would surround himself on the board with loyalists who would never hold him accountable. Obviously, this is a classic cult leader behavior. Remove all internal checks and balances and surround yourself with yes men. All the while, Gothard's public image remained that squeaky cleaned, never married elder statesman of faith. Parents brought their teens to his conferences. Pastors invited him to speak at their churches. He even became somewhat of a figurehead in the broader Christian homeschooling movement. His ATI program was one of the big players in the 90s homeschool boom. In fundamentalist Christian media, Gothard was heralded as a pioneer of family revival. Few outside fundamentalism had any idea who he was, let alone what was brewing within his ministry. But that was about to change. Micah Murray, a former IBLP adherent, later reflected on his awakening. Quote, "You never think you're in a cult when you're in a cult," he wrote. "We talked about how it was a cult, joking at first, but as I spiraled closer and closer to the center, the realization began to sink in. The jokes became real. For Micah and many others who lived through it, the Gothard organization had indeed crossed the line from mere strict group to a full blown cult, with Bill Gothard as its authoritarian leader. By 2011, Bill Gothard had been ruling IBLP for half a century, 50 years of unchecked power. He was nearly 77 years old, but showed no intention of slowing down or stepping aside. However, forces outside his control were finally aligning to challenge him. The world had changed. The internet and social media provided a platform for the voiceless, and former IBLP students who had left the fold were beginning to find each other online. Whispers turned into conversations, and conversations turned into a coordinated effort to expose the truth. In March 2011, a website called Recovering Grace was launched by an ex IBLP ATI alumni. Its mission? To allow those whose lives had been impacted by the teachings of Bill Gothard and IBLP to share their stories and find support. At first, Recovering Grace posted general articles critiquing Gothard's interpretations of scripture and the legalism of IBLP. But in 2012, they dropped a bombshell. A woman using the pseudonym Lizzie published a first person account detailing how Gothard had groomed and SH'd her as a teenager. Her story was painfully similar to Julie's and others. Gothard singled her out, brought her to HQ, touched her inappropriately, and created an atmosphere of confusion and shame. Lizzie described feeling uncomfortable and eventually realized that these were all violations. This was the first time a victim had publicly and directly accused Bill Gothard of sexual misconduct. And that opened the floodgates. Over the next several months, Recovering Grace was inundated with emails and testimonials. By 2014, more than 30 women had come forward with allegations echoing the same patterns. These were not claims of R-word or overt essay, but rather a consistent narrative of grooming, harassment, and molestation under the guise of ministry. Young women, some as young as 14 or 15, recounted incidents of Gothard touching their legs and breasts over clothing, giving lingering massages, pressing his body against them during hugs that lasted way too long, or making comments about their appearance. In some cases, he allegedly propositioned them for more, like the incident with Julie and the exposed genitalia, though it appears actual intercourse did not occur, or at least was not reported, aside from the earlier Steve Gothard situation. Many of these encounters, though, did happen at IBLP facilities, often in Gothard's office or on ministry trips. And worse, some of the women said Gothard knew of serious SA by others and failed to report it. One allegation claimed that a teenage girl confided to Gothard about being molested by her father, and Gothard simply sent her home, back to her abuser without alerting authorities. Gothard discouraged a staffer from seeking professional help after she revealed a past R word. He effectively silenced these women's traumas and then threw them back to the wolves. This was a bleak picture that was emerging. The man who preached sexual purity and absolute authority was he himself an abuser operating under a cloak of authority. It's a scenario that's all too familiar in authoritarian religious sects. Power and reverence provide cover for predation, and victims are shamed into silence. But now, the silence was broken. In February 2014, as the accounts gained more public traction, IBLP's board of directors finally took action. They placed Bill Gothard on indefinite administrative leave and announced an internal investigation. To many longtime followers, this news was very shocking and disillusioning. Imagine hearing that the spiritual teacher you've literally modeled your life after is being accused by dozens of women of being a total creep. It must have just been too much to process. And of course, Gothard denied the details, but he did issue a carefully worded apology for certain behaviors. In a statement that was later deleted from IBLP's website, Gothard apologized for holding hands, hugs, and touching the feet or hair of young women. He said that he crossed boundaries and violated a trust, but he was also quick to add that he never kissed a girl nor touched a girl immorally or with sexual intent. So, this quasi confession essentially admitted to inappropriate physical conduct, but claimed it wasn't inherently sexual. And obviously, it did little to stem the outrage. I mean, it felt like a classic minimization. Yep, I may have done some things that kind of look bad, but I didn't mean it that way. They just look, doesn't, it's not as bad as it looks. But for many, that was too little, too late. So by March 2014, Gothard resigned as president of IBLP, ending his formal leadership of the organization that he founded 53 years earlier. In its public statements, the IBLP board concluded that no crimes had been committed, but that Gothard had indeed, quote, acted inappropriately and would no longer be part of the ministry. They quietly removed his profile from the IBLP website and even banned him from coming onto IBLP properties or events going forward. Now, essentially, Bill Gothard, age 79, was being put out to pasture in disgrace, at least officially. However, if you thought the story ended there, well, you would be mistaken. The survivors were not content with merely an internal probe and a quiet resignation. In 2015, a group of brave women decided to seek justice through the courts. In October of that year, 5 women filed a lawsuit in DuPage County, Illinois, against IBLP as an organization, accusing it of willfully covering up SA and harassment within the ministry, going back decades. Now, initially, Gothard himself was not named as a defendant, perhaps a strategic move to focus on an institutional failure, but by January 2016, the lawsuit was amended. And now 10 women were plaintiffs, and Bill Gothard was explicitly named along with certain IBLP board members. And the claims were explosive. The suit alleged that Gothard essayed and harassed the plaintiffs, detailing instances of him grooming young female employees and engaging in sexually inappropriate behavior. It also accused IBLP leadership of ignoring and concealing these acts. Notably, one plaintiff alleged that Gothard R-worded her, a claim that Gothard vehemently denied, telling the Washington Post, quote, "Never in my life have I touched a girl sexually. I am shocked to even hear that," unquote. As word of the lawsuit spread, even more people reached out to join. By February 2016, the lawsuit had grown to 18 plaintiffs, 16 women, and even 2 men. The inclusion of male victims indicated that abuse in IBLP wasn't only Gothard on female, there were allegations that a male staffer molested a boy and that the culture enabled various forms of abuse. The pattern was clear. An environment that prioritized authority and image to such an extent that predators, including but not limited to Gothard, could operate with impunity. Gothard's side, unsurprisingly, moved to dismiss the lawsuit on multiple grounds, chiefly the statute of limitations. Most of the incidents were well outside the time frame for criminal or civil action, given that they occurred many years prior. The plaintiffs argued that the discovery of the conspiracy and the lasting trauma extended the timeline, but this can be a tough sell legally, unfortunately. And the case dragged on for 2 years amid motions and procedural jousting. And in the meantime, Bill Gothard, free from IBLP's control, made some attempts to resurrect his teachings elsewhere. He set up a personal website proclaiming his innocence and even organized a couple of small seminars under a new ministry name, trying to reestablish contact with his old followers, but luckily with limited success. Ultimately, in February 2018, the women's lawsuit was dropped before going to trial. The public explanation was somewhat murky, but essentially it boiled down to those unique complexities and statute of limitations issues. It's not that Gothard or IBLP were exonerated in a trial. Rather, the case couldn't move forward procedurally. Upon the suit's dismissal, Gothard, of course, crowed that he'd been vindicated and claimed the accusations were part of a coordinated conspiracy by bitter ex members. But the plaintiffs stood by their stories, with one stating that they only dropped the suit due to the legal hurdles, not because their allegations were false. So then, what was the fallout for all of this? For Bill personally, his formal influence ended, but he remained a free man, never criminally charged. He's in his 80s now, approaching 90, and he keeps a very low profile, though by many accounts, he still believes in his mission and has never genuinely repented in the eyes of his detractors. IBLP, the actual organization, survived but was deeply shaken. In an attempt to start anew, IBLP relocated its headquarters to Big Sandy, Texas, around 2015, leaving the Hinsdale campus that had become synonymous with scandal. The ministry's income and followers dwindled significantly. In fact, the Advanced Training Institute homeschool program stopped accepting new enrollments in 2021, effectively winding down that chapter, though they claim the wisdom booklets are still available for purchase. IBLP's public communications have carefully distanced the ministry from the man who created it, but only to a point. On one hand, they acknowledged his inappropriate actions, but on the other hand, the organization still celebrates Gothard's legacy and foundational teachings on its website to this day. I mean, it's as if they want to have it both ways. Well, yeah, the messenger failed, but like the message is still holy and true. And even Bob and Michelle Duggar, perhaps the most infamous IBLP adherents, echoed this sentiment, stating that while Gothard is a fallible human and the accusations were troubling, the biblical principles they learned from IBLP remain valid. Truth is truth, even if the messenger fails. What about the truth of the women who were essayed when they were teenagers by a creepy old man? What about them and their truth? Give me a break. Now, for many ex IBL peers, the unveiling of Gothard's abuses was the catalyst to re examine everything they'd ever been taught. If the teacher who exemplified godly living was, in their view, a fraud, what did that say about the system he built? The years following Gothard's downfall saw a growing exodus of young adults from IBLP, people who'd grown up in it and now just felt totally betrayed or simply awakened from it. Some of these individuals, like Jill Duggar and Ginger Duggar, would go on to publicly denounce the cult like rules and seek a completely different path. The ripple effects extended to the broader evangelical community, contributing to conversations about the dangers of extreme patriarchy and legalism in churches. So, what do you think about the cult next door? It's really terrifying how in the fringes these groups can be and grow and amass these followings and amass this money, and like we're just kind of none the wiser. I mean, there are a lot of flaws to social media. There are a lot of negative aspects to social media, but I think one of the most positive ones is the fact that it's bringing so much more to the surface. And that's why I think we do need to keep talking about these things, even if they feel like they've been a little overdone or talked about before, because you just never know when there's going to be a copycat. You never know really what to look for because a cult doesn't look like a cult at the beginning. It always looks like something good, something that could make your life better. And now when we have these fringe groups or these these cults essentially that are creating these communes and raising children with only one way of thinking in their own homeschooled arena, when those people do end up waking up, it's got to be so scary and it's got to be a massive culture shock to leave and go out into the real world. I think that, I mean, and it obviously is a tactic to keep people in. Because if the rest of the world is so fearful and you're not going to know what you encounter out there, and you haven't been educated well enough to even thrive in society, why would you leave until there's a massive scandal like this? So everyone, I'd love to hear your opinions on this. I would love to hear if you have any experience with this one, just because it went on for so long. It's crazy. Or anything kind of adjacent to it, like very evangelical. Like a lot of this reminds me of like literally like Bridgerton era patriarchal rules where like women and men couldn't even like be in the same room together by themselves. It's just like so crazy that people would be like promoting that. But I believe that people promote stuff like that, that like extreme control because they want to do these dirty things behind the scenes. Every time there is in anyone who has these like intense rules and like ultra high standards, I feel like they always have skeletons in their closet. But I don't know, we're not all squeaky clean, you know what I'm saying? Anyways, guys, thanks so much for watching. Let me know if you want that multi-part deep dive on the Duggar family and their scandal. I would be happy to bring it to you. I was a little vague on that on purpose in this video, just to kind of teach you guys a little bit. But let me know what you guys are looking forward to seeing this month. Thank you guys so much, and I hope you please stay safe out there, ask questions, and always stay skeptical. I'll see you in my next video very soon. Bye, y'all.